Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tita, for representing MDI and hosting this talk today, and thank you, Edgar, for IDRC's support. And I'm very pleased to be part of the MDI IDRC lecture series. Can everyone hear me okay in the back there? Yeah? It's loud enough? Okay. As Edgar mentioned, my background is both as an academic. I'm a labor economist at the University of Ottawa, and I work on employment issues in developing countries. But at the same time, I have one foot in the policy world where I have been engaged through a lot of country-level work, both at the World Bank and also in the kinds of activities that IDRC sponsors that Edgar talked about. So what I'm hoping I can do in my talk is combine some of the analytical work that labor economists do about employment with some real experiences I've had over the years at the country level actually dealing with difficult issues around job creation. And what I want to do today is really talk about how to think about job creation strategy. And I'm going to make three basic points. One is that countries have to be very clear on what they hope to achieve through their job creation strategies. Job creation strategies don't happen on their own. Many countries think that as long as they grow rapidly, and I'm aware that this is a period of rapid growth in Myanmar, but a growth strategy by itself is not a job strategy. So I want to make it clear that it's very important for countries to develop their own job strategy, okay, distinct from a growth strategy. The second thing I want to emphasize is that in developing a job strategy, it's critical for you to understand the dynamics of what's happening in your own country's labor market. So the role of data and analysis is absolutely critical. And this is something that IDRC tries to promote through its research. Hopefully MDI can make a major contribution through its work. And certainly in my work at the World Bank, a lot of it has to do with supporting countries in doing the analysis that's required to really understand what's happening in your own country. Because job strategies are not universal. There's a very strong element of country-specific strategies required. So that's my second point, that you really have to understand your own country. And the third point I want to make with respect to job strategies has to do with the fact that it needs to be a multi-sector approach. Ministries of labor, for example, cannot by themselves develop and implement a job strategy. Ministries of labor are important, but there are many other considerations that need to be involved, and I hope to be able to illustrate some of this today. And this often involves not only government but industry and workers, but also other ministries besides the Ministry of Labor are often very important players in developing job strategies. So I'm going to try to talk for maybe 30 or 40 minutes today. No more than 40 minutes, because I know that I get very boring after 40 minutes. So I'll try to keep it to 30 or 40 minutes. And hopefully then we can have a very good discussion. But if during the course of my presentation there's something you want to clarify, something from one of the slides, for example, that is not totally clear, please feel free to ask me a question to clarify. And I really hope that the effectiveness of this lecture will really depend a lot on the kind of discussion that the slides I show generate in terms of your own questions and our own discussion. So I'm going to cover 5 things today in my talk. The first has to do broadly with how job creation fits into development. And here, as Edgar mentioned, I was one of the authors of the World Bank's World Development Report on Jobs in 2013. And they developed a very holistic framework to thinking about jobs. So I'm just going to briefly talk about that as the starting point for my lecture. And then I've been already mentioned the word job many, many times, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about what do we mean when we talk about a job, and what is a good job? Because often I think we have preconceptions about what a good job is, and that can really differ depending on the country context. Then I'm going to get into the policy area. And again, going back to the World Development Report, we developed what we call a policy triangle to illustrate the key components of a job strategy. And I'm going to talk about this policy triangle. But then I'm going to really focus on country-specific priorities. A job strategy in Myanmar is going to look very different than a job strategy in Singapore, which is going to look very different than a job strategy in my own country, Canada, for example. So I want to talk a little bit about country-specific priorities. And then finally, if we have time, I've been doing a little bit of work on the particular question of labor force participation of women, which is, seems like a separate topic, but if I have time to summarize our work in that area, I'm going to do it. First of all, because the participation of women is a very important part of job strategies in the first place. But second of all, I think it illustrates a couple of things that I hope, be able to communicate as messages of my talk. One is the usefulness of data and analysis in generating effective policy solutions. And second of all, this point I've already mentioned, that often the most important elements of a job strategy, in the case of women, for example, may well involve things that we don't traditionally think about as part of labor policy. Okay? So that's just a quick roadmap to what I'm going to talk about today. So let me get started with the World Bank framework. So in the World Development Report, we tried to make one major point, and that is that job creation is absolutely critical for development. And in a sense, this is obvious. Whatever countries I've worked in, policymakers want advice on how to create jobs. They're very conscious of the fact that to meet the needs of their citizens, job creation is one of the most important things they need to do. And there are many, many different ways that an effective job creation strategy can contribute to a country's development. Certainly, living standards. Obviously, earnings are the most important source of income for almost all households, so the extent to which you can develop jobs that have high levels of earnings, you're going to contribute to a country's living standards. Jobs also contribute to productivity because there's an enormous learning process that goes on when people work. And the more people are engaged in jobs that allow them to learn, develop further, pick up additional skills, the more that is going to contribute to a country's economic development, productivity, and growth. And the third thing that labor economists don't typically talk about, but we emphasize a lot in the World Development Report, is the relationship between jobs and social cohesion. That by participating in the labor market, by working in activities that contribute to the development of a country, people get involved in the mainstream of the social and economic current of the country. And much of the problem, for example, in many countries with young people now, we can directly link to the fact that there aren't employment opportunities and they don't feel like they can benefit from or contribute to the social and economic mainstream of society. So when people participate in the labor market in jobs that they value, they tend to become more engaged in the communities they're involved in. They tend to develop stronger connections with the country's institutions. They tend to value their participation in the society and contribute more to the society more than people who always remain on the outside of the labor market. So as a starting point, I just want to underline, and this is something I'm sure everyone in this room already believes in, but I want to underline the importance of jobs, not only as a way that people achieve the living standards they need, but the impacts of jobs are much more widespread than that. Now, so I've talked about jobs. I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by a job. And a lot of times when we think about jobs, we're thinking about a wage employment position, where you're working for an employer for a wage, ideally in the formal sector where you're participating in social insurance programs and so on. But in fact, in much of the world, that's not what a job is for most people. So this looks at the breakdown of employment among the major developing regions of the world, and it just divides that employment into farming, people working in agriculture, and most often people who work in agriculture are working in a family production unit. The second is self-employment, and the third is wage employment. So if you look at these bars, depending on what part of the world you're looking at, the composition of employment is very, very different. And this is an important starting point for thinking about what a job is and what kind of strategies we need to improve people's working lives. So in Europe and Central Asia, for example, it's true that when we think about a job, for the vast majority of the labor force, that is a wage employment job. People are working for an employer for a regular wage or salary. But when we go to some regions like East Asia and Pacific, which is the region that Myanmar is in, that wage employment sector is much smaller. And important segments of the labor force are either working in farming or are working in self-employment. And when we think about this specifically for Myanmar, here I'm using data from the World Bank. They have an upcoming report on jobs in Myanmar. They have some data where they have broken down the working population in detail, depending on exactly what it is people are doing. And here's the breakdown for Myanmar based on the 2015 survey on poverty and living standards. And again, this is the first point I want to make, that you need to have empirical evidence in order to start to think about what the labor market looks like and ultimately what policies are going to address the issues that people need to address. So in Myanmar, I'm just organizing the distribution of employment into three broad categories. The first is the percentage of the workforce that's in family farming. So this is not including agricultural workers who are in wage employment for an agricultural employer. These are people working on family farms. And that's over a third of the working population, 35% of the population. The second group, up in the upper left-hand corner, are people who are working in household businesses, but not in agriculture. And that's 26%. So when we think about wage employees, and I'm including people who are working in wage relationships in agriculture, that's only 40% of the workforce, 39% of the workforce. So this traditional notion we have of a job being earning a wage or a salary from an employer only describes the situation for 39% of the working population in Myanmar. So as we think about job strategies, we need to think about the fact that 60% of the people in this country are not working in that type of employment relationship. But the jobs they have are equally valuable, and in some cases the jobs they have may even be better than the traditional notion of a wage employment job. So let me turn to that. I've been working recently with some new data that was collected by the ILO and Gallup. So every year Gallup does a world poll. and they ask a common set of questions to a representative sample in, I think it's 142 countries around the world. And in 2016, the ILO partnered with Gallup, and they asked some specific questions, additional questions on employment. So we have all of the data from the annual Gallup World Poll, which asks a really wide range of questions. Plus we have an additional set of questions on employment that the ILO put in. So this is a very interesting source of data, and this is what I use for the analysis I'm just going to show you. And later on, if I have time to get into the question of female labor force participation, I'm going to return to this data. So what we did with this ILO Gallup data was we had data for 4 countries: Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So 4 countries in what we call the Mekong region. And what I wanted to do was compare the lives of people who are in wage employment, self-employment, whether they're full-time or part-time, whether they're unemployed or out of the labor force. So all of the different statuses they might have in the labor force. I wanted to see how these different groups of people compared according to some variables that we don't usually have in labor market analysis. So the Gallup poll asks people how satisfied they are with their lives. And they ask people to rate their life satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is like not satisfied at all, where life is very difficult and they're very unsatisfied, to a life satisfaction of 10, where life is perfect, and I don't know who would rate their life as 10, but presumably there are some people who do. So what I wanted to see was, okay, like our traditional notion, and certainly as a labor economist, my assumption would have been that people in regular wage employment that have the security of wage employment would probably score higher on a life satisfaction measure than someone who only worked part-time or who was unemployed or was self-employed. And so we did a regression analysis to try to, so we controlled for all kinds of other factors, and we tried to isolate the impact of employment status on life satisfaction, and we compared it to the life satisfaction reported by full-time wage employees. And interestingly, we found that in a statistically significant way, self-employed people assess their lives at a higher level of satisfaction than wage employment, and part-time employees assess their lives at a higher level of satisfaction than full-time wage employees. So this was kind of surprising, and again, not something I would have predicted. Another interesting variable that's in the Gallup data, which we don't have in traditional labor force surveys, is they asked people, how was their day yesterday? And they asked them, did you feel anxious? Did you feel happy? Did something good happen to you? Did something bad happen to you? Did you feel well or did you feel ill? And they score people on how they assess how positive their day was the day before the survey. And again, this is not something I learned in graduate school in economics, variables like this, but it, ultimately, as people concerned about policy, we are concerned about what will help people have better experiences in their lives. And here, too, we compared employment status against the standard of full-time wage employment. And we found that, again, self-employed people said that their day yesterday had been more positive than full-time employees. Part-time employment also was associated with a more positive daily experience, and people who were out of the labor force, not unemployed, but out of the labor force. Everyone understand the distinction between being unemployed and out of the labor force? So these are people who are not looking for jobs. They also had a more positive day, the day before the survey, than full-time wage employees. Then the last thing we looked at in this work was how healthy people were. So this is based on their self-report. We asked people, how they would rate their personal health. And again, self-employed people and part-time people reported their personal health as more positive than full-time wage employees did. Now, the reason that I emphasize this, and I think that this is interesting work, and we're not the only people who are finding this kind of thing. There's some very interesting work being done in Africa, for example, that has also found this, probably with better research methods than I have. As a labor advisor, I would often go into government departments, and regardless of the level of development, the policymakers, their model was, how can we create more full-time wage employment? And that's totally understandable, and if I was a minister of labor, I probably also would have had that prior. But when you start to look at data, you start to raise some questions about, well, what exactly is the kind of employment we want to encourage, okay? And this doesn't answer it all for me, but it starts to give me some indication that I may want to have a broader view of job creation than the most traditional stereotypical view of trying to increase the formal wage sector. So let me talk a little bit about growth and job creation. I had mentioned at the beginning of the talk that growth strategies and job creation strategies are not the same things. So let's think about job creation in this region of the world. So Southeast Asia, and I would include East Asia in this as well, has been probably the most successful region in the developing world in terms of job creation. And I know with my students, when I often give them an exercise to pick a country that had sustained growth and improvements in living standards and reductions in poverty, and more often than not, the cases that they come back are from this region or from East Asia. So this, in many ways, has been a very successful region. And the model of economic development that you all, I'm sure, know very well is one that has been based on structural transformation. That countries have gone from a largely traditional rural economy and moved into more of a modern, often urban economy. And this describes first the earliest wave of economic development after World War II in Japan, and then there was a second wave of the Four Tigers, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And then we had the successful structural transformation in Malaysia, for example, and then there was China, and now there's the new wave of countries in the region, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, that to greater or lesser degrees are showing a similar type of economic dynamism. And the basic model in this region has been one of, first of all, increasing productivity in agriculture, which raises people's living standards in rural areas, but it also starts to free up labor for migration to the modern sector. Then the second stage is the migration of resources, people, financial resources into urban areas. And then the third stage is upgrading urban industries from entry-level, low value-added, low productivity wage sectors, garments and textiles being the classic example, to gradually higher productivity, higher value-added industries, and ultimately into very sophisticated industries, which is where Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, for example, are now. So this is the model of development that really has worked quite well in raising living standards and creating better and better jobs in much of this region. But there's a question about whether this model will be the recipe for success for the latest generation of Southeast Asian countries, including Myanmar. And I can't pretend to say I have the answer for that, but there are lots of reasons to wonder if this model may be unfolding differently than it did, let's say, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. We have Industry 4.0 and the impact of technological change. We have different trading patterns. All of this has implications for job creation in very different ways than the environment was that Japan or the Four Tigers or even Malaysia faced. And there is a feeling, for example, that the potential for creating manufacturing and industry jobs in urban areas that will improve people's living standards, raise their productivity, and do all the good things that urban job creation in modern sectors is supposed to do. There are more and more people who are wondering exactly how much scope there is for in the future. And a very well-known American economist named Danny Roderick has come up with the term he calls premature deindustrialization. So the notion of premature deindustrialization is, so in this traditional model that I've described for this region, so you go from agriculture to urban jobs, and the urban jobs start out being low wage, low productivity, and then gradually countries upgrade into high wage, high productivity jobs. And then eventually, as wages get really high and as countries' human capital gets really high, manufacturing starts to decline and countries move into service economies. Okay, so that's the last stage in this modernization story. So my country, for example, Canada, which has a very high GDP per capita, almost 80% of the workers are in the service sector now. So we've had a deindustrialization where because of our cost structure and because of the very high level of human capital, they become essentially knowledge-based service economies. So they become deindustrialized economies. The same is true of the United States, which largely explains the election of Donald Trump as the president, because he basically put forward a campaign that said he can halt that process and maintain. There is a point at which countries start to move out of manufacturing and industry and move into the service economy. And what happened was that earlier generations of countries they started their deindustrialization at very high levels of income, and they moved into services when they were already quite rich. And the countries at the right-hand side of this chart, you see like Germany, Great Britain, Sweden, Italy, Denmark, all of the Western OECD countries. This indicates how rich they were when they started to deindustrialize and move out of manufacturing and into this service economy. But as time went on, that peak, when the amount of manufacturing employment reached its peak, started happening at lower and lower levels of income. So you can see that Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, for example, they reached their peak in terms of manufacturing employment at lower levels of income. As you move to the left of this chart, it means you reached your peak at a lower level of income. And Roderick and some of these other people are arguing that for the latest industrializing countries, they will reach their peak of manufacturing employment at even lower levels than earlier generations because of technological change, because of international competition. And I've done some preliminary work in this region which indicates that it's true. Singapore and Korea reached their peak of manufacturing employment at quite a high level of income. Malaysia at a little lower level of income. China at still a little lower level of income. And I looked at Vietnam, and it seems to have peaked in terms of its percentage of employment in manufacturing at even a lower level of income. So it raises questions about whether how far countries can go with this traditional model of structural transformation, okay? Because if you're not going to build up this big manufacturing sector that absorbs all of the rural workforce into better and better jobs, how is the upgrading going to happen? It's very difficult for countries to move from largely rural, agriculturally based economies directly into service economies without that intermediate step of this big manufacturing or industrial workforce. So this has really sort of caused us to think exactly about the process of economic development, and as someone who thinks about job creation, it makes me wonder, well, exactly what is if this growth and structural transformation story is not going to be the recipe in the future that it was in the past, then what is the way to think about job strategies? So let me move now into, again, going back to the World Development Report on jobs. Yeah.
So before we move to this part, can I ask this part? Just what to do about it? Structural transformation is in terms of growth or in terms of job creation? Because, for example, that in terms of structural transformation, what I understand is that initial stage is agriculture, and that transform GDP contribution is gradually shifted to the manufacturing and then the service sector. But in terms of job creation, what I understand is that number of jobs is gradually shift from agriculture and then to manufacturing and the service sectors. So what I really do not understand this point, because in Myanmar case, for example, that GDP contribution is highest in agriculture sector, and then now it's gradually shifts to the service sectors. So I'm just thinking about structural transformation in terms of growth or structural transformation in terms of creation of jobs. So thank you.
Right, okay. That's a big question. I think that this theory of structural transformation essentially the chain of events is the structural transformation involves a change in the composition of where a society allocates its resources, whether it's people or money or investment, into more and more modern sectors. And that process drives growth. So I see it as the structural transformation, the reallocation of resources is the determinant of growth. But there's a feedback loop between them, because the more a country grows, the more it can invest in these modern sectors, which will attract more and more resources. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. So let me turn now to how to think about a job creation strategy. So essentially what I've tried to establish until now is that a growth strategy, whether it's driven by structural transformation or something else, may not, in 2017, lead to the creation of more and better jobs, however you define those jobs. And I've also tried to make the point that defining those jobs may not be as straightforward as we traditionally think. So in the World Development Report, we essentially set up this policy pyramid. And it has 3 levels. Strategies always seem to have 3 levels. So we wound up with 3 levels. And the argument was that all of these levels are important for creating more and better jobs. And the basic level is what we call the fundamentals. And these are things that every country, regardless of their particular context, need to pay attention to. So if you don't have a stable macroeconomic environment, you're going to have trouble generating good jobs. You need to have an enabling business environment. In other words, a business climate that encourages investment. Human capital is hugely important. Getting a more and more skilled workforce is another fundamental. And then finally, and this is linked to the business climate, a rule of law and respect for rights, providing a certain environment for investors. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these fundamentals. They're fairly obvious, but without those fundamentals, you're trying to create jobs in a very, very precarious environment. Okay, so that's the first one. The second layer of the pyramid we call labor policies. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this right now, but I know that some of you are from the Ministry of Labor, and I'm certainly very happy to get into this more in the question and answer section of the program. But essentially, these are things like labor regulation, collective bargaining, social insurance programs, training, active labor market programs. These are all important, but our analysis led us to the conclusion that in most countries we studied, they tended not to be the most important thing. They can play an important role in terms of improving opportunities for particular groups, helping vulnerable workers get into the labor market, help people manage risk of losing jobs or having big drops in earnings. But they're rarely the key to generating more and better jobs, okay? There are exceptions to that, but that's a general statement that comes from our analysis. And then the top part of this pyramid is priorities. And by this, we mean country-specific policies. And this is where knowing the situation in your own country and having a strong evidence base to understand the labor market in the country becomes so important. So these first two levels basically apply everywhere. And they might look fairly similar everywhere. But this third level, the priorities, can be very, very country specific. And this is where two things come in. One, doing a lot of data and analysis on your particular country so you understand your challenges. And second of all, realizing that, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, addressing your country's challenges may in fact involve things that we don't traditionally think about as jobs policies. So I'm going to talk mainly about these priorities, these country-specific policies, and how a country should be setting the priorities in terms of its job strategy. And in the World Development Report, we actually set up a typology looking at countries around the world of 8 different jobs challenges. And these jobs challenges are what identify the most important priorities for the country. And countries can fit into more than one of these challenges. So one is agrarian economies. Agrarian economies have their own particular challenges in terms of employment, partly because most of the people are working in the rural agricultural sector. Often, typically in agrarian economies, living standards are very low. So the priority needs to be improving the productivity of the agricultural sector in order to raise people's living standards and start to prepare them for higher income, higher productivity work. So that's an agrarian economy. We also have conflict-affected economies. And here, this is a very difficult environment to create jobs. But job strategies in countries that have been affected by conflict often involve reintegrating displaced populations, for example, or reemploying former combatants. In other words, jobs that bring people into the mainstream and give people alternatives to conflict. And a third category, and all these first two categories are all things that in some extent apply to Myanmar. The third category is what we call urbanizing countries. And these are countries that perhaps they've moved beyond the agrarian economy stage purely, so they've experienced some productivity growth in the rural sector. They're moving people into urban sectors, and the issue here is how do you build functional urban economies that are attractive settings for investment in modern industries, and how can you start to think about upgrading the industry structure in those urban settings. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about Bangladesh as an example of a country that faced these challenges related to urbanization in a very comprehensive way, an experience I think that has some interesting applications for Myanmar. A fourth category is resource-rich countries. I'm going to go through the rest of them. We also have small island nations that have their own particular challenges. Countries where the dominant challenge is high youth unemployment. This particularly characterized many of the countries we looked at in Southern Europe, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. Formalizing countries. These tend to be middle-income countries that still have very large informal economies, but the citizens of those countries now think about how they can start to achieve the formal protections and all the benefits of formal economies that North American and Western European countries have, for example. And then there are some countries where the dominant issue is how to deal with population aging. And in order to learn more about the experience of these different types of jobs challenges, what we did was we looked at the experiences in eight countries, each one characterized by one of these challenges. And that's this book, Jobs for Development, that Edgar mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, where we tell the story of all of these countries and try to understand better the jobs challenges that individual countries face. And what we did was we picked countries from all around the world. I already mentioned Bangladesh, which was our example of urbanizing economies. Mozambique was our example of an agrarian economy. We looked at Ukraine as the aging economy, and so on and so forth. So by looking in detail at these particular examples, we were hoping to be able to understand better each of these different jobs challenges that I talked about before. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Bangladesh, partly because I think Bangladesh has dealt with many of the issues that are very relevant for Myanmar now. And also, I think the Bangladesh experience, for all it's not a perfect story of development, but it's a very interesting example of a country that operated on many fronts to mobilize a rural, unskilled, low-income workforce gradually into a more urban workforce with higher incomes. It's a country that has made important gains against poverty and has done very well according to the Human Development Index, for example, which measures living standards, health, and education outcomes. It's still a poor country. It still has lots of issues, but I think that its story, as told in this book, is an interesting roadmap for thinking about how to deal with some of the issues of development that Myanmar may be dealing with now. So my first point, though, in terms of applying this framework is to really know your own country. And when we look at Myanmar, I'm struck by the relative lack of information and evidence about the labor market situation here. So even compared to other countries at this same level of development, there's less analytical work in Myanmar, there's less data analysis going on. And as a result, I think that there's less evidence-based policy making going on than we might see in some other countries, because the whole idea of evidence-based policy making is based on the fact that you have to generate evidence at some point. And I think that there are big gaps in this country. Now, in 2015, the Ministry of Labor and ILO did the first labor force survey. The only thing I've seen from it is the summary report that the ILO published, I guess, about a year ago now. Without getting into a lot of details about that, it did have some highlights that clearly are important fundamental facts to think about when we think about a job strategy for Myanmar. So we see, for example, it's still largely a rural country. 72% of the labor force, at least as it was counted in the labor force survey, is in rural areas. 76% of employment is in the informal sector. 61% of employees are working in firms that have less than 5 people. So I showed that earlier slide, the pie chart about the distribution of employment in Myanmar. This is reinforcing. That was a different data source, but this is reinforcing those observations. people work very hard here, average weekly hours of 52, which is high by international standards, and the earnings are quite low. So just to start to think about, well, how are we thinking about Myanmar within this diversity of jobs challenges I mentioned earlier? This is kind of a first run at the facts that you would want to keep in mind. So let me turn to Bangladesh, which 25 years ago had statistics that didn't look that different than the ones I just put up for Myanmar. So Bangladesh, over the past 25 years or so, they have had a process of linking the rural and urban economies in very interesting ways that generated better jobs for many people and better human development outcomes for many people. And I just want to identify some of the big parts of the story. And this really illustrates the point I've made on a number of occasions today, that a job strategy involves many, many different things. It's in effect looking at development through the lens of jobs. So we had several drivers of the process of job creation in Bangladesh. And some of these happened sequentially and some of them happened simultaneously. So we had, for example, the Green Revolution that increased agricultural productivity. And that released labor first to the rural non-farm economy and then ultimately to urban labor markets. We had infrastructure that increasingly linked the rural and urban economies. So there were major bridge projects, for example, that linked the east and the west sides of the country with very important improvements in the access of people to labor markets and product markets. There were there were major public investments in human development. Investments that reduced the fertility rate, which was a key change in the country's landscape. And big improvements in human capital, especially for women. So there was a very kind of women-centered human development strategy that paid off. They opened up to the world. So they removed barriers to trade and foreign direct investment, so they developed this export-oriented ready-made garment industry, which was a destination for a lot of the rural labor. There were strong connections that always remained, though, between the rural and urban economies. So large flows of labor that went into the cities for certain periods of time and then went back into the countryside at certain periods of time where their labor needed to be used in the countryside. So there was strong connectivity still between, and integration between the rural and urban labor markets. And there were various ways in which the urbanization had positive effects on rural areas. So this is how it differs from the traditional structural transformation story I told originally. So we had large remittances going from urban areas to rural areas. There were changes in land tenancy that allowed people to hold on to their land but still spend periods of time earning income in the cities. And various things that improved the productivity of farming and raised people's living standards in rural areas and released them for availability in urban areas. So this is, I think, a very interesting story that, as I mentioned, brings into play all of the different ingredients of a process that led to improvements in jobs in the Bangladesh setting. So let me think about let me tie a bit of this discussion on job strategies together. So the fundamentals, as I mentioned, are important everywhere. So you can't have an effective job strategy if you have higher levels of macroeconomic instability, or if you have an unattractive business climate, or if you have a very poorly educated labor force. Human capital and the quality of the business climate, according to work the World Bank is doing, are both real priorities in Myanmar in terms of getting the fundamentals to a more attractive level for job creation. Labor policies may not be a major barrier to jobs in many cases. It may not be the most important policy, but human resource development, human capital investment is very, very important. And then this notion that country priorities really differ depending on the country context and the challenges that a country faces. The importance of data and evidence to identify the country-specific challenges, but also a recognition that many sectors may be involved in generating an environment for job creation. So in the case of Bangladesh, just to go back to that case, agricultural policies were part of the story, infrastructure was a big part of the story, human development and population planning was a big part of the story, social protection, so it really spanned a lot of trade and investment. So their job strategy involves, when we look it back, involves a lot of different sectors. It's not something that a Ministry of Labor can do alone. Okay, so let me finish by just spending a couple of minutes talking about the last issue, which is female participation in the workforce. I'm shifting gears a little bit. I'm going back to that ILO Gallup survey that I talked about earlier in the presentation. And I wanted to talk about this, spend a few minutes on this today for 2 or 3 reasons. One, I think labor economics is dominated by men, and the challenges of female labor force participation tends not to get the attention that it deserves in order to have a comprehensive, inclusive job strategy. Second of all, this is an illustration of how to use data to try to identify what the barriers are to creation of jobs. They often turn out not to be the ones that we might think about in the absence of evidence. And third of all, even in the case of improving female labor force participation, it turns out that many of the priorities may well rest in sectors that are well outside of ministries of labor, for example. So, as I mentioned, the ILO Gallup data we have for 4 countries in this region. We have Myanmar, we have Thailand, we have Vietnam, we have Cambodia, and that's 2016 data. We don't have Laos for 2016, but we had Laos for 2012, so I included that in this chart. And the one thing I wanted to focus on here is female labor force participation. So these are the different categories of employment I talked about earlier. And these are not exactly the ILO categories, but they're meaningful. We could organize workers into 5 different groups. 1, wage employment on a full-time basis. Second of all, self-employed people on a full-time basis. Third of all, part-time people. Fourth, people who are unemployed. In other words, they're not working, but they would want to work, and they're actively searching for work. And then people who are outside the labor force. They're not working, and they're not actively searching for work. And this region, people work very hard, both in the labor market and outside the labor market. But according to classical definitions, a high percentage of women are outside the labor force. So in Myanmar, according to these data, 32% of adult women are not in the labor force. The ILO data, the labor force survey data that I cited earlier, also showed a fairly low level of female labor force participation. The poverty and living conditions survey also found a fairly low level of female labor force participation, often 20 to 25 points lower than it is for men. So we wanted to look at the standard way that a labor economist might look at this would be to look at the difference in wages between men and women, to look at potentially discrimination in the labor market. There are a standard set of tools that you might look at. But this ILO Gallup data allows us to broaden that investigation because it asks a lot about people's attitudes, which is not conventionally considered by economists, but obviously can affect what people do quite a bit. So we use this data to try to understand why women who were not in the labor force were not in the labor force. And our starting point was that the survey asks women who aren't in the labor force whether they would like to be doing paid work. And that's essentially the definition I'm talking about here. And the vast majority of women who were not in the labor force responded yes, they would like to be doing paid work. So then the question is, since that's their preference, why is that not happening? And we look at various things. We included, for example, whether households, and particularly men in the household, felt it was appropriate for women to be out in the labor market in paid work. And this shows, for these 4 countries, the percentage of men and women in each country who said, yes, it's acceptable for women to be in paid work. And the majority of people in all 4 countries said yes. Although it's interesting that Myanmar came lower than Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. This shows that in Myanmar, 67% of men responded, yes, it's perfectly acceptable for women in my household to be in paid work. 77% of women said, yes, it's perfectly acceptable for me to be in paid work. The percentages of acceptability were higher in the other 3 countries we looked at. So there may be something there that's worth thinking about further. Another thing that might come into it is, are there differences in the opportunities available for men and women in the labor force? So is it possible that women are not participating in the workforce because they believe there aren't acceptable opportunities for them in the workforce? So this Gallup ILO survey asks both men and women whether they think that a woman would have the same opportunities as a man who was identical in terms of education and experience, okay? And the result was that generally in this region, both men and women believe that the opportunities for women in the labor market are as good as they are for men of equal education and experience. So just taking the Myanmar case at the top, 24% of the respondents said, in fact, a woman of a certain education and experience would have better opportunities than a man. The vast majority, about 65%, said men and women with the same experience and education would essentially have the same amount of opportunity. And then there was only a small minority in all of these countries who had worse opportunity than men. Now, I do think we need to be a little bit cautious in terms of data like this, because I think people do sometimes respond to these questions in what they believe is the most socially desirable way. So it may be that we have to discount these results to some extent, but still, you would have to discount them a lot to believe that people's attitudes were very different with respect to the opportunities for men and women. So we know that a lot of women who are out of the labor force would like to be in the labor force. We know that, although this is less true for Myanmar, we know that both the majority of men and women in these countries we looked at believe it's perfectly acceptable for women to be in paid work. At least according to the results of the survey, we know that men and women do not necessarily believe that women have inferior opportunities in the labor market, given a certain level of education and experience. So what about other barriers? And the survey asked this, what I thought was a very interesting question. They asked women what were the major challenges they faced in participating in paid work in the labor market. And for these 4 countries, I highlighted the 4 factors that come out as the most significant in all of these countries, okay? There was a long list of potential factors. These are the 4 most important ones that come out everywhere. And where more than 20% of women mentioned this as the major challenge, the squares highlighted in red, and where between 10 and 20% of women said it was a major challenge is highlighted in yellow. And you can see in Myanmar, the number 1 challenge is balancing family and work, by far. And then there are 3 others that come in quite prominently. One is abuse, harassment, or discrimination in the workplace. Second of all is a lack of transportation. And third of all is lack of affordable care for children or other kinds of relatives. So these seem to be important parts of any story. So if I was trying to think about some policy interventions to improve female labor force participation, yes, certainly laws that ensure equal treatment of men and women in the labor force is important. Certainly programs that improve skills development are really important. You know, traditional instruments can play a role, but I would also need to think about, well, what kinds of interventions could be put in place that would help people balance work and family and provide care for relatives or children? Because the time use survey data shows that in Myanmar, as in all other countries, it's women who bear the major brunt of those responsibilities. I would need to think about transportation. You know, just simply getting to markets and jobs is a big issue, especially for women. So as a policymaker, probably the most important things I could do to improve the participation of women in the workforce would be to think about things that normally as a labor policy person I wouldn't be thinking about in the first place. So this reinforces one of the main messages of my talk today, and this is where I want to close, that particular conditions in a country can really matter, and data and analysis are critical for really understanding those conditions, because, as I mentioned, this leads to a very different view on policy than I might traditionally have. And third of all, developing an effective job strategy needs to be a comprehensive activity, probably coordinated at a high level of government, so that different ministries with different jurisdictions can contribute in various ways, and also, of course, can't be disconnected from the needs of industry and the workers who are in it. So let me stop there. I covered a lot of topics. I hope that it's been useful for people, and I welcome any questions or comments or discussion.